So the first few years of college for me were really difficult. I've told you all before that the first week of my sophomore year of college, Hurricane Katrina ripped through my hometown and completely changed our lives. And I had to drop out of school that fall semester to help my parents rebuild our home. And, you know, when you go through something traumatic, it takes time to recover. It causes you to seek God out in new ways. And so when I returned to school the spring semester of my sophomore year of college, my journey with God changed, and changed rather drastically. Now, during my freshman year of college, I got heavily involved with the Baptist Student Union on campus. I was a Methodist, but the Wesley Foundation on campus wasn't all that strong, and so I joined in with the Baptist, and I got my feet wet with them. But when I came back to school that spring semester, boy, I was all in. Now, there were new students who had showed up, so there was new dynamics, but the fervor for Jesus amongst this group of people was unlike anything I had ever experienced before up to that point in my life. And you know, my calling to ministry started in that college ministry. God did a lot of work with me in my time there. Now, that spring semester, I got introduced to a new band. And this was back in the day when you would like carry an album full of loose CDs and you would like share them with friends and then like rip copies of them and like make mixed CDs for your friends. Well, they introduced me to a new band that semester and their name is Shane and Shane. And the particular album that they introduced me to was their live album called An Evening with Shane and Shane. Friends, I'm not exaggerating when I say that it became the soundtrack that God used in my life during a difficult season. During a season of discovery, a season of hurt, and a season of formation. On that album is a song simply entitled Psalm 13. They took the words of David out of the book of Psalms and they put music to it. And I want to read you the words of David this morning. He writes this: "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him. And my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." Now, scholars don't know exactly at what point in David's life he wrote Psalm 13, but they think it could have taken place in one of two instances. The first possibility was when King Saul was hunting David down in order to kill him. You see, the king had become convinced that David was his enemy and was seeking to put an end to his life. Now, this is the same David who had killed Goliath, the giant, in the stead of the king, King Saul, because Saul lacked the courage to go out and do this thing himself for the people of Israel and for God. This was the same David who was the instrumentalist who played music for Saul when Saul was troubled and needed to have musicians come and play a soothing tune. This was the same David who had become Saul's son-in-law. And you think you got in-law problems, right? This was the same David who had become one of the leading generals in Saul's army. And yet, Saul had become convinced that David was the problem and was hunting him down to kill him. That's the first possibility of when David wrote Psalm 13. The second possibility of when David wrote Psalm 13 was when his son Absalom was hunting him down in order to kill him. Now, in this instance, David hadn't been perfect. There had been some things with his children that he did not handle well. Some dynamics that got way out of hand, and his son Absalom was furious at his father, to the extent that Absalom tries stealing the throne, stealing the crown, and hunting his father down to kill him. In both instances, David was on the run from people who wanted the worst for him. And David felt alone. And so he writes the words, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" Friends, sometimes it feels like God is distant. Now, we're in this sermon series where we're looking at some of the most asked questions regarding faith, and one of them is, why does God feel distant sometimes? Now, if you're new to faith in Jesus, you probably haven't experienced this before. But if you've walked with God for any amount of time, there comes a point in our lives, and oftentimes several points in our lives, where it feels like God isn't listening anymore. Where it feels like the situation is beyond hope. Where it feels like your enemies are winning. And that's exactly where David is when he's penning these words 3,000 years ago. And yet it's the experience that all of us who've walked with God for any period of time, we have. But the question is, why? Now, one of the most influential books I have ever read is a book called Soul Keeping by John Ortberg. I have preached on this book many times before. In it, John Ortberg talks about how the fact that each of us has a soul, and we need to do things to keep our soul healthy, because let's face it, we don't often think about keeping our soul healthy. And in the neglect of our soul, it becomes jaded and hurt and wounded and broken and bitter over time. But toward the end of the book, Ortberg, he talks about this phenomenon that we as followers of Jesus eventually all get to. And he calls it the dark night of the soul. And it's exactly what David is writing about. Ortberg describes it like this, though. He says, the dark night of the soul is not simply the experience of suffering. It's suffering in what feels like the silence of God. The dark night, he goes on to say, the dark night is God initiated. Like God starts this. And then he asks the question, well, who moved in this season of life? He says, in the dark night of the soul, it is God who moved. The dark night of the soul is when you are in a lonely place, you're experiencing suffering, and God feels absent. And if you've walked with God long enough, you know you've been there. And what Ortberg says is that not only is this an experience that is common to believers, God allows you to go through it. If you and God feel distant in a season, it's possible that God is the one who moved. And that doesn't always sit well with people. You're like, well, what do you mean? God left me? Well, isn't that our perception? Isn't that what David is writing about? When I first read this about 7 years ago, I really wrestled with it. I really struggled with this concept. But all of a sudden, a lot of difficult seasons in my life started to make a lot more sense. How many times from my sophomore year of college on have I cried out to God, God, where are you in the midst of this? And I've heard nothing back. There seems to be a distinct absence of hearing from God in those most difficult moments. And those are the toughest seasons to walk through. We question God. God, where are you? And it's like all we hear back are crickets. Is that you right now? Friends, if that is you or has been you, then I invite you to let this song, this Psalm of David, as sung by Shane and Shane, be the soundtrack to this season.
I will wait. I will wait. I will wait on you, Lord. You are going through the dark night of the soul. Those are words that should come on your lips and your heart.
Because, friends, waiting on God is the only way to see light at the end of the tunnel. If God stepped away for a season, then you need to wait for him to take that step back. But if he stepped away for a purpose. But why did God get distant from me? That's the million-dollar question. I don't know. But in nearly 20 years of doing ministry, this is what I've learned. When you're in that dark night of the soul, you're going to want to pray for it to be over really fast, which, by the way, is not a bad prayer to pray. God, how much longer? Can you make this thing shorter? Even David asked, God, when are you coming back? And is it going to be any time soon? But a better prayer I've learned to pray, that when you feel distant from God, God feels distant from you. A better prayer to pray is this. God, who do you want me to become in the midst of this? Who do I need to become as I'm going through it? We don't like pain, so we want it over fast. But God uses pain to form us in ways that happiness and prosperity simply cannot. Sometimes God lets you go through a difficult season where he takes a step back in order to let you be formed by trouble. God formed David into a king by letting him be chased by Saul. God formed David into a repentant father by letting him be chased by his son. God felt distant in both instances because if God had kept David from suffering, David wouldn't have changed. But sometimes the suffering we must endure comes only when God has stepped back. Friends, God is not gone in your dark night of the soul. He just feels absent for a purpose. And so the better prayer to pray is, God, who do I need to become in the middle of this? Because God forms you via all things. But sometimes the biggest catalyst for change is pain. You can wallow around in it, or you can look to hasten an end to it by becoming who you need to become in the midst of it. David had to endure the absence of God in order for him to figure out who God needed him to grow into. And in both instances, Scripture says that David praised God on the other side. So friends, what are you learning from God's distance that you cannot learn from God's presence? So when you find that God has grown distant, and sometimes you and God are distant because you've brought sin into your life and you need to repent of that sin for you to take a step back towards God again. Yet other times, if God is taking a step back, it is so that you might suffer for a little while. And that suffering forms you in a way that otherwise simply would not happen. But in those difficult moments, may the words on our lips and in our hearts be, I will wait on you. I will wait on you. I will wait on you, Lord.